Hi, this is Adrian Laurie, and this is the History and Philosophy of Psychotherapy, a map of the territory, part 2. Now, in the first video, part 1, I talked about 7 basic therapy traditions. In this video, we're going to get a little more comprehensive. We're going to talk about 7 pairs of traditions, because each of those basic traditions that I named in the first video, we can divide into 2 sub-traditions, one of which is more internally focused and the other is more externally focused. And this is going to get us more into details. Now, if you're an experienced therapist and you watched that first video, you may have noticed there were certain important things that I was leaving out. It was an oversimplified presentation, which I did on purpose for people who are new to the field, wanted to start with a simple orientation. But in this video, we're going to get more into details, more comprehensive. And we're going to talk, as I say, about 7 pairs of traditions now, which I'll name. But let me also just say some of the names that I'm using, the terms that I'm using for these sub-traditions are the same terms that I used for some of the broad traditions that I named in the first video. That's roughly in keeping with the way these terms are used in the field. Sometimes they're used in a narrower way, sometimes they're used in a broader way. And you don't need to pay too much attention to the terms. What's really important is the information, and ultimately what's really important is the work itself, okay? But don't pay too much attention to the terms, okay? I'm trying to use them in the most descriptive way possible. And so another thing for the experienced therapists among you, there are a couple terms that I use in ways that would be somewhat idiosyncratic in the field, that I do that for educational purposes. Again, I'm trying to be as simple and descriptive as possible. And when I use terms in a way that's a little different, I will explain what I'm doing and why. Okay, now enough of that. The pairs of traditions we're going to look at today are as follows. We're going to look at the psychoanalytic and object-relational, the cognitive and behavioral, the existential and interpersonal, the narrative and systemic, the body and Gestalt, the psychosynthetic and transpersonal, and finally the art and drama/dance traditions. Okay, 7 pairs of traditions. I'll say a little bit about an important early innovator for each one of those, and when this video is done, you're going to have a real good idea of the classic therapy field and what's in it. Okay? All right, now let's get started. First pair of traditions is psychoanalytic and the object-relational. Okay? Now, psychoanalysis started with Freud and oriented around free association and interpretation. Really, what I talked about in the last video, that was the psychoanalytic, more classically oriented psychoanalytic portion of this sort of broad psychoanalytic tradition. That also includes this other sub-tradition, the object-relational therapy sub-tradition. Okay. Now, what's object-relation therapy? Well, it started with an innovator, Ronald Fairbairn, who was a Scott analyst, and he both diverged from Freud significantly theoretically, but importantly for our work here, he did start doing therapy in a different way. Now, object relations is both a therapeutic form, there's also theory, and if we were talking about theory, which these videos are not really so much about theory, but about the practice of therapy, when it comes to object relations, I would have to talk about Melanie Klein, okay, because she was an important object relations theoretician and also an important practitioner of psychoanalysis who importantly worked with children, but in her practice she was traditional in the sense that she was doing free association and interpretation. Or when she worked with children, she'd have them play and then she would do interpretation. Okay, but Fairbairn really started approaching the work of therapy itself in a different way. And the difference was, rather than orientation around the value of the interpretations to help the client organize their affective experience, that's the more classical form, With the object-relational therapy, the focus becomes more on offering what we could think of as a corrective nurturance of the client. Okay? So it's like a kind of re-parenting, and the therapist is taking on a somewhat parental type role in offering for the client a space where the client can work through all sorts of feelings that they weren't able to work through or digest when they were growing up. Okay? So it's a kind of like it's a place for a client to feel lots of different things. And one modern expression of this object-relational therapy tradition is therapies oriented around attachment. Okay, this is a very popular approach these days, a popular concepts of attachment. Attachment theory really grew out of the object-relational tradition with a guy named Bowlby a number of decades ago. Attachment theory, this idea that we can form a secure attachment with our mother or other caretaking figures. That will serve us well, and relationships basically feel comfortable and secure in relationships and in ourselves as relational being. Or we can develop insecure attachments where we don't feel secure in the relationship, and we'll either be avoidant, or we're anxiously grasping after attention, and so on. These different states of being in relationship with another person that the attachment theorists talk about, and then many therapists these days sort of orient their therapy around providing what's known as a secure base, right? A place for its client, again, to feel anything and express anything they're feeling or experiencing, going through, etc., and get a better form of nurturance than they got when they were growing up. So empathy with wide range of feelings, including toward the therapist. As an example, I had an object-relationally oriented therapist for about 5 years. I was in a group. It was my group therapist. I was in a therapy group as a member. Neat guy, nice guy. And one of the things he would do this would really fall into the object-relational approach was, we were encouraged to say whatever we were feeling, particularly things that we might consider to be irrational, including at times, anger toward him, the therapist. This is not unusual among therapists in general, group therapists in particular. But as a client in the group, I did sometimes feel annoyed with him or angry at him. And when I was on my game, I would express that to him. And he was always very empathic about that. And that's something that, at least in our culture, we often don't get a lot of that empathy with our anger toward the caretaking person, right, or the authority figure. So this is a different experience. We would say, I'm mad at you. And to have him really take that in and be able to empathize with it, it's actually very healing. So that would be part of an object-relational therapeutic approach. Okay, so Ronald Fairbairn gets into attachment orientation in the more modern day. A good book about this would be Attachment in Psychotherapy by David Wallen. Very well written. And I'll put a link to that below. Okay. All right, now let's move on. Cognitive and behavioral. Cognitive is really what I talked about in that first video. It goes back to Alfred Adler. Okay. It's encouraging clients to look at their troubles head on and make conscious choices about how to deal with them. The behavior therapy tradition goes back to a guy named Andrew Salter, who originated assertiveness training. And there's a sense in which you can say behavior therapies is oriented around assertiveness, and it's a sense of basically like face your fears, right? But Salter was having clients do this in group settings and practice assertiveness with others, which I think there's something to that. I think a lot of our fears actually do go back to interpersonal fears of assertiveness. But in any event, Salter's work did sort of evolve into desensitization work in general among behavior therapies, and then in the modern day we have the so-called third wave behavior therapies like dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is sort of oriented around a combination of helping clients learn to accept reality and then also to actively deal with it. Okay. A resource here that I might suggest would be Marsha Linehan, who was a developer of dialectical behavior therapy and who I love. Her work is really great. She designed it for clients in quite a bit of trouble, on the verge of suicide, or having troubles that are kind of known by the term of borderline personality disorder. It's a bit of a relationally fragile states that some people tend to struggle with, and she developed this for them, but we're working with them. But it's a beautiful system. I'm not well trained in it. I don't do it myself, but it really does work very well for some people. And also, Marsha Linehan philosophically is amazing, and really anything by her I can recommend. It's beautiful philosophically. So again, I'll put a link down below. The one other little historical note about that I might mention is there was a physician named Edmund Jacobson before Salter, who was the originator of relaxation training. And Salter integrated relaxation training into his assertiveness work. And there's an important sense in which all throughout the history of behavior therapy, we could think of there always being two themes: relaxation and assertiveness. So that even in the modern behavior therapies, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, you really can think of them as still oriented around teaching relaxation and assertiveness, right? Acceptance and commitment is kind of a more philosophically sophisticated, could we say, variant of relaxation and assertiveness, okay? Now, Edmund Jacobson was a physician. He wasn't a psychotherapist, and so I put Salter as the real originator of behavior therapy. But it's a good way to understand behavior therapy as oriented around relaxation and assertiveness. So there you go. Okay, cognitive and behavioral. Now we're going to talk about the existential and interpersonal traditions. Okay, existential started with Otto Rank, orientation around helping clients deal with these sort of basic concerns of life, those including death and the human will, the fact that we have choices and therefore responsibility. There's freedom. Irvin Yalom, who wrote a great textbook about existential psychotherapy, I believe in the 80s, he originally wrote that, breaks it down to 4 basic human concerns: death, isolation, freedom, and meaninglessness, which it just can sound a little bleak, but it is actually ends up being very, very enriching to really address these issues. Helps you prioritize, and that's a great textbook for that approach. And really, was kind of what I described in that first video. But the interpersonal approach has kind of like a sister tradition to the existential in the narrower sense. And the interpersonal approach, the primary innovator there, I would say, is Harry Stack Sullivan. Okay, now this is an approach where, like the existential, there's a focus on the here and now. But with the interpersonal approach, we're looking at the interpersonal relationship, and therapeutically, you're looking at what's happening in the relationship between me and you, right? The therapist and the client, and the grounding is in each of us as adults. So it's distinguished from the object-relational approach, where the therapist is in more of a nurturer, caretaker type role. Client is in many ways more of a childlike role. With the interpersonal approach, it's adult and adult, and how is this interpersonal process actually going? Are you expressing what's here and now? Are you avoiding it? Coming from this kind of orientation, I might at times, and I would talk to a client about using this approach before I would ever start to use it. But I might say to a client, "How are you and I doing right now? What's it feel like, being with me right now, talking with me right now?" And perhaps at a certain moment, a client might say, "Well, yeah, I feel kind of distant from you." And then we might look at what's going on there. How did that occur? What's happening? The other thing is, I might at times, and again, I talk to a client about this first and see if this feels like an okay way to work, and never on the same day, as I might start to use this approach to get the clients okay. Usually the client's actually enthusiastic about it because they're interested in interpersonal feedback, honest interpersonal feedback. We don't typically get that in our lives. We can get it in an interpersonally oriented therapy. I might actually convey feelings I'm having toward the client on a kind of personal type level, like, I find myself feeling a little bit irritated with you right now. I feel like you're pushing me away. Now, this idea that a therapist could convey this to a client can sound crazy to newer therapists, sometimes even more experienced therapists. This is sort of outside of the range of their training, but it really can be very therapeutic and helpful. If you've talked to the client about it first, and not like 5 minutes before doing it, but there's an orientation there of like how this can be helpful. We'll be real with one another in this way, and you do it judiciously, but it can be very helpful, and because it gives a client a dose of what's really going on. I find they typically really appreciate it. If I do have that kind of feeling of irritation or feeling pushed away, typically the client will agree, yeah, I'm feeling kind of distant too, and we'll kind of look into what's going on. And very often, since the client started to feel something that they didn't really want to tell me about it, right? This is something like that. Now, on occasion too, maybe I do something that has kind of turned a client off, and in discussing this, that will come out, right? Now, see, I'm no angel, and I'm not perfect either. So that's part of this existential and interpersonal approach, is that as a therapist, I'm not putting myself in the position of some authority figure who's always right about everything. I'm a person too, right? And even when I'm in the therapist role doing therapy, I'm still a person. And so I don't need to pretend like I got everything right or that everything I do is perfect, okay? I just can have my own issues, and on occasion that can affect what I do, and we don't need to pretend that that's not the case. And that's a significant part of this existential approach, sort of a relationship between equals, right? So, okay, so hopefully that gives you a decent idea about that. And I'll post a link to some resource for an interpersonal approach. Probably Yalom's other textbook, which is The Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy. Group therapy is probably the place where the interpersonal approach has its kind of fullest and richest expression. Because in group therapy, you have the clients interacting with each other and examining what's happening in the interpersonal processes there. It's a very powerful form of therapy. The therapist ends up kind of creating a group culture where these sorts of feedbacks and working through of difficulties and strengthening of interpersonal resources can occur in this group setting. I love group therapy, and that's its great approach. And Yalom's textbook on group is a great textbook. Okay, existential and interpersonal. Now, it's time to move on to our next pair of traditions, the narrative and the systemic. Now, narrative therapy, capital N, is a form of therapy that was developed by an Australian, Michael White, and there were others involved in that, but Michael White's typically think of as the most important there. But prior to Michael White, Milton Erickson had what we could consider a small N narrative approach, in the sense that he was often telling stories to clients that were relevant to their troubles. Now, in the capital N narrative approach, the therapists are eliciting the client's stories, right, of themselves, and then helping clients do those stories in a different way, right, or reframe things in a different way to make for a more resourceful story. And really, this narrative approach does have a lot to do with eliciting the client's resourcefulness. Now, I would put it back to Milton Erickson, who was very much about evoking patient resourcefulness. There's an interesting exercise that you can do where you take some problem that you're having and you tell the story of that problem, but rather than talking about I, you put yourself in the third person. Adrian Laurie got up this morning and was in a bad mood, blah, blah, blah. And I keep going on to describe some problem that I'm dealing with. And then you can read the story and sort of see how it goes, and look for interesting things that might pop out at you about how you're framing the story, and how might you frame it differently. Are you framing the protagonist of the story in a way that's kind of weak? Could see it in a different light. There's an interesting self-help book called, how is it called? I forget. Take Charge of Your Story. I'll put a link to it below. That talks about this exercise, really goes into detail. And this is basically a narrative type approach. Milton Erickson was a real genius at not only of this type of approach, but just of therapeutic communication in general. He's been called the Mozart of communication. So he's important in other respects as well. I recommend looking at videos from the Milton Erickson Foundation. You can see videos of Erickson himself. And I'll put a link to that below. Now, the systemic orientation, which is a sort of sister tradition to the narrative, as I conceptualize it, at least. It also, in some ways, goes back to Milton Erickson, because he also had a systemically oriented approach. If I was going to name a different innovator there, it seems that it would probably be a guy named Don Jackson, who worked a lot with families. And Don Jackson, in association with some other people in his group, we're working with families where one of the members was having schizophrenic experience with schizophrenia. But instead of looking at the person with the schizophrenia as the patient, these therapists start to see the whole family basically as a system that is having a symptom in the form of the schizophrenia in this particular person. And they looked at the communications in that family and started finding ways to kind of, first of all, integrate themselves into the system of the family by the way they developed rapport with the family, and then they could do things that would start to change the nature of the communications in such a way as to change the function of the family. I'm saying this in the form of abstractions, but it's a very different approach to therapy than many of the others. Involves the use of what's known as therapeutic directives, right? He's telling clients do this or do that. It's very unfamiliar to some therapists, but it can be very powerful. It does have a lot to do with the we could say the benevolent use of power. And this is a concept that for many therapists is like, what? power. That doesn't sound so good. The systemic therapist would say, well, you can't really avoid it. All of us are going to have an influence on others in the way we interact with them. And what we're doing is taking full responsibility for that and figuring out how we can use that in the most helpful way. Okay? So I'm going to keep it at abstractions, but to just give you a little bit of an idea there. And I'll find some resource that I'll link to below if you're interested in learning more about that kind of approach. Okay, so that's the narrative and systemic. Now we move on to the body and Gestalt traditions. Now, body psychotherapy is originated by Wilhelm Reich, which I talked about in the last video. It's working with movement patterns, muscle tensions, and the original body psychotherapists were literally working with the body, hands-on manipulation, and there are some forms of therapeutic work today that still do that. So somatic experiencing would be one of them. But practically speaking, you can kind of get an in to the body therapy type work with an exercise that I call tension exaggeration. It's something Wilhelm Reich used to do with patients. You find a tension in your body and then you exaggerate it. And you kind of hold that contraction for a little bit and just kind of meditate on that. At some point, you might ask yourself, what am I doing? And something might come to you. Oh, I'm hiding from a monster, or I'm getting ready to punch something, or I'm wanting to run. This is a way to reconnect the conscious mind with the part of your system, which we could think of as the unconscious, that's holding on to some tension. You see, as a habit, right? For example, when we repress an emotion, we have to do it physically, because emotion is partially physical. For example, we're wanting to cry, and for some reason we've got to repress our tears. Well, we're going to have to contract some muscles to do that, and that can then become a habit pattern in the body. So by exaggerating a tension, because often tensions just feel like, what's that? That's just, I'm tense. We have no clue what's actually happening in there or why that's occurring. By exaggerating the tension, we are reconnecting our conscious volition with the unconscious habit pattern. And if you do that and then reflect on it, as a practice, it can happen that there's an integration that occurs where you kind of get back into contact, at least in a loose way, with what you're actually doing there, and it may no longer be relevant in the present, at which point that tension may dissolve or integrate into a new pattern in the body, without conscious effort at that point, other than just the awareness of what's going on, which can arise out of this practice. Okay, but body psychotherapy. You can look at a book I think I mentioned in the last video called The Language of the Body by Alexander Lowen, who was a student of Wilhelm Reich, the developer of bioenergetic analysis, very interesting form of therapy from the past. All these have evolved into systems that we have in the present. Sensory motor psychotherapy, Pat Ogden is a good modern approach, part of the body psychotherapy tradition. Okay, now Gestalt therapy, which I would consider to be the sister tradition of body psychotherapy, originated by Fritz Perls and probably also his wife Laura Perls. I suspect that the two of them together were integral in developing that Gestalt therapy. But Fritz Perls was the one who was writing the books and doing the workshops, and he was on stage and a bit of a character. So he's the one who's sort of known as the founder of Gestalt therapy. But Gestalt is looking at the unique aspect of Gestalt is looking at the sensory experience and to a good degree in the interpersonal encounter itself, right? In a therapy or in a Gestalt group. And so it's focused on what the experience is like, on the phenomenology of the experience. I did a seminar with a Gestalt practitioner in Los Angeles years ago, and one thing I noticed he would do, because he would work with different ones of us, and so we would get to observe what he was doing, and we'd talk about it, and we would experience it ourselves. One thing he would do a lot was, one of us would be kind of talking about something, and he'd say, "Hey, slow down. What is that really like?" That's what he'd just say. I just remember him saying that all the time. Slow down. What's that really like? And it would help a person start to really examine, well, what's this experience actually like? And sometimes there would be, for example, a movement from talking into tears, just as one example. But it's a really helping us get down into the real sensory experience itself, right? Now, Gestalt in its origins, as Fritz Perls did, it was actually included a lot of different things. It's a bit of a eclectic mix of different elements. He was bringing in elements from psychodrama and maybe to some degree from an existential approach. Gestalt is sometimes considered an existential approach, but I put it more in the somatic realm. There's a lot of things that Perls brought into it. My impression is that as Gestalt has evolved, it's kind of it become purified into its essence, which is, as I would see it, this kind of phenomenological. What is this really like, right? A good resource there would be a book called Gestalt Therapy Integrated by Henry and Miriam Polster. And I'll put a link to that below. Okay? So that's the body and Gestalt traditions. All right, moving on. Now we're going to talk about the psychosynthetic and transpersonal traditions. Now, this is one of these terms I'm using in a somewhat idiosyncratic way, psychosynthetic. Psychosynthesis was a specific school of therapy developed by a guy named Roberto Saggioli, but I'm using psychosynthetic, small p, in a broader way to include Carl Jung, who I would put as the primary initial innovator for this sub-tradition. Jung did use the word psychosynthetic in a letter to Freud early on. He said, Freud, might it be more accurate to say that what we're doing is psychosynthetic rather than psychoanalytic, putting things together rather than breaking them apart to examine them. Freud did not have an enthusiastic response to that comment, but it makes me feel comfortable using the term psychosynthetic, again, small p, to describe this tradition coming from Jung, including Roberto Saggioli, and the orientation here is around putting together different parts of the self. Now, there's a spiritual component to it, because when you're looking at these different parts of the self, and Jung theoretically talked about archetypes of the collective unconscious, there's a transcendent aspect to it, because in order to look at these different parts of the self, you have to transcend these different parts of the self to be in that witnessing place, right? So it's a bit of a spiritual type orientation, and one evolution out of this orientation was what we could think of as subpersonality, where Saggioli talked a lot about subpersonalities, but Jung too had an exercise he called active imagination, and one part of the exercise would be dialogues between different aspects of the self. So you can have a conversation with a part of yourself. You can write out a dialogue, or so this can certainly be done in psychotherapy. You can have a conversation with your child self, for example. The movie Inside Out, the Pixar cartoon from, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever, it is actually an expression of this this kind of approach. A moving movie. I was in tears for about 80% of it. But it can be a very powerful way to work with the psyche, is these sort of dialogues. Well, aside from that movie, if I think of another good resource for that, I'll put that down below. But that would be the approach I would call psychosynthetic, again, small p, because we're putting together different parts of the self. Now, what I'm calling the transpersonal tradition in this narrower sense, because in the first video I used transpersonal, the broad tradition that includes psychosynthetic and now this narrower transpersonal I'm about to talk about. This is an approach where I would put as the most important innovator Stanislav Grof, okay, who started by doing LSD therapy. Now, when that became illegal, he and his wife Christina developed a different way of evoking similar phenomena, and they called that holotropic breathwork. Okay, now in holotropic breathwork, you're doing it's typically done in a group setting. There's music playing, and you are doing intense breathing for a long time. And what happens is there are phenomena that you begin to experience that by a modern conventional Western standard are rather weird. Visions or experiences or experiential memories of one's birth, for example, or experiential visions of gods, goddesses, figures from mythology and figures from mythologies that the client may not be consciously familiar with. All sorts of interesting experiences which helped Grof develop some interesting theory about different aspects of the psyche. But the idea here is we're developing experiential contact with factors of the psyche that go beyond the traditionally personal. So transpersonal, subtradition, and Grof is really interesting guy. You can find interviews with him on YouTube, and I'll link to something with Grof if that's an area of interest for you. Okay, so psychosynthetic and transpersonal. Okay, and now the final pair of traditions, the art and drama/dance traditions. Now, drama therapy and dance therapy are really two separate traditions, but I'm kind of putting them together for the sake of education right now. Art therapy, there's a number of people that will be named as important early innovators there. I think Florence Kane is really important. She wrote a book called The Artist in Each of Us, and she developed a technique called scribble drawing that I think is just a really fantastic exercise. You draw a scribble with your pen, you look for 3 different images to pop out at you, you reinforce those with your pen, and then you tell a brief 1 or 2 sentence story about what's going on, how those images relate to each other, just describing the scene, and then you can interpret that. So, well, what does this mean about me and what I'm feeling, and or how I'm experiencing life at the moment. Art therapy tradition, rich therapy tradition, they have their own licensure process. I'm not exactly sure why that is historically, but the use of art in therapy can be very rich. Sand tray therapy is a form that has a relationship to the use of art in therapy, where you've got a tray of sand and some figurines placed in different ways, and then it's like, what does that symbolize? Very interesting realm. And like I say, they have their own licensure, and so they're kind of fierce about that. You can't call yourself an art therapist unless you have that license. But you can use art in the therapeutic process of if you have training or supervision there, and it can really be a very rich area. Drama therapy, or what goes really back to psychodrama, was developed by Jacob Moreno. I talked a little bit about that in the last video. It's typically done in a group setting, and the therapist acts as a director of these scenes, allowing clients to to process through experiences in the context of a kind of drama. Can be very emotionally evocative. I've done some workshops in it, and one of them was one of the more transformative experiences I've had. Some rage came up in me, which the therapist sort of saw was there, and gave me a bat and had me slamming my bat down on this large foam block, screaming and yelling. And that was transformative. It was highly cathartic. After that experience, I was different man, more relaxed, more clear in my communications. So some people will make fun of that kind of thing, but it can be healing and transformative. Psychodrama is not always about rage, but that's one of the things that can get worked out there in a pretty powerful way. Jacob Moreno was the original developer of that. Dance therapy or dance movement therapy goes back to Marianne Chase. As far as I know, not much interaction with drama therapy, but they're both therapies based on the performance arts. But dance movement therapy should also be a really incredible, transformative healing. I've not been trained in doing it as a therapy myself, but I've experienced it on a client side, and it's fascinating. Music is turned on, and you're kind of invited to move however you might like, and you will encounter interesting feelings come up in that kind of experience. And meanwhile, my experience of it was that the therapist is saying things that amount to a kind of empathy with the movement. It's a little hard to describe, but there's something about it that, just like in talk therapy, where the therapist has a way of kind of drawing you out, making it comfortable to talk. You end up talking through things in a way that is healing and transformative. A dance movement therapist has this way of making it more and more comfortable to move in very organic ways. You encounter emotions in that process, and are able to discover things and to move through things and develop new capacities. Just a fascinating form of work, dance movement therapy, Marianne Chase. And I'll put a resource below for that. Probably a video from one of their conferences, which I've never been to, but I've heard that they're really cool and interesting. And those are our 7 pairs of traditions. So we've talked about 7 pairs of traditions: the psychoanalytic and object-relational, Freud and Fairbairn; the cognitive and behavioral, Adler and Salter; the existential and interpersonal, Rank and Sullivan; the narrative and systemic, Erickson and Jackson; the body and Gestalt, Reich and Pearls. Pearls was a patient of Reich, by the way. Just an interesting little tidbit there. The so Body and Gestalt, Reich and Pearls, the Psychosynthetic and Transpersonal, Jung and Grof, and the Art and Dance/Drama, Kane and Chase/Moreno. Okay? 7 pairs of traditions. And this now is pretty comprehensive as far as classical therapy forms go. This is a map of the territory. The idea is not that you become a master of all of these. I'm certainly not. But it gives you a map and a way to have a sense of what's out there. If you're new to therapy, some of these might sound more interesting to you than others. You can kind of make your way in. I tend to spend a few years kind of invested in one of these, and then it seems every 4 years like there will be a shift, and I become interested in another, and gradually add things to my repertoire, my vocabulary, my toolkit, if you will. And so, I hope it's useful for you. In the next video, part 3, we're going to talk about what I think of as meta elements of therapy, including the issue of the therapeutic relationship. We'll talk about the common factors, research, tradition, what makes some therapists more effective than others, and therefore how can we become better therapists in general, regardless of what tradition we're working in. We'll talk a little bit about the role of theory in the work of therapy. Talk a little bit about this issue of diagnosis, where does that play in, and perhaps some other things. And that'll be part 3. So stay tuned for that. Hope you've enjoyed this one. Be in touch with any comments. And it's been Adrian Laurie. It's good to be with you, and more soon. Okay, bye-bye.